The Mosaic of Lydia. Lydia stood at the edge of a vast, desolate field, staring at the horizon. The sky was a patchwork of bruised purples and ashen grays, much like her heart. She had spent years hiding behind a carefully constructed mask, a facade that shielded her from the world but also imprisoned her. Her flaws, or what she believed were flaws, were like jagged shards of glass embedded in her soul, sharp, painful, and impossible to ignore. She had always been a perfectionist. As a child, Lydia would meticulously color inside the lines, her crayons sharpened to precise points. But while other children saw coloring as play, Lydia saw it as a test. A single errant stroke felt like a failure, and failure was unacceptable. This mindset followed her into adulthood, where every perceived imperfection became a burden she carried silently. Lydia worked as an editor for a prestigious publishing house. Her colleagues admired her keen eye for detail, but they didn't see the sleepless nights or the anxiety that gnawed at her like a relentless tide eroding the shore. She lived in constant fear of being found out, that someone would see through her polished exterior and expose the messy, flawed person beneath. One day, Lydia's world began to crack. It started with a manuscript, a debut novel by an author named Eleanor Hart. The story was raw and unpolished, filled with grammatical errors and clunky sentences. Yet, it pulsed with life and emotion in a way that Lydia couldn't ignore. The protagonist was deeply flawed, a woman who stumbled through life making mistakes but learning to embrace them. Lydia found herself drawn to the character, feeling an uncomfortable kinship with her. As she worked on the manuscript, Lydia began to question her own life. Why did she strive so hard for perfection? Why did she hide her vulnerabilities? The questions were like tiny seeds planted in her mind, taking root and growing, despite her attempts to ignore them. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, Lydia found herself wandering into an art gallery. She wasn't sure why she went, perhaps it was the soft glow of the lights or the promise of quiet solace. As she wandered through the exhibits, she came across a mosaic, a massive piece made entirely of broken glass and ceramic shards. The mosaic depicted a sunrise over a turbulent ocean. The shards were jagged and uneven, yet together they formed something breathtakingly beautiful. Lydia stood transfixed, tears welling in her eyes. She felt as though the mosaic was speaking to her, whispering truths she had long buried, that beauty could be found in brokenness, that flaws could be transformed into art. The next day, Lydia made a decision. She would stop hiding. It wasn't easy, years of self-doubt and fear don't vanish overnight, but she began to take small steps. She confided in a close friend about her struggles with anxiety. She started therapy, where she learned to confront the critical voice in her head that constantly told her she wasn't good enough. And she began to embrace her imperfections, seeing them not as flaws, but as facets of her humanity. As Lydia worked on Eleanor Hart's manuscript, she realized that editing wasn't about erasing imperfections, but about shaping them into something meaningful. She allowed the rawness of the story to shine through, understanding that its imperfections were what made it resonate so deeply. When the book was published, it became an instant bestseller. Readers wrote letters to the publishing house, sharing how the story had touched their lives. Lydia read each letter with tears in her eyes, feeling a sense of purpose she had never known before. Years later, Lydia stood on a stage at a mental health conference, sharing her journey. She spoke about the mosaic in the art gallery and how it had changed her perspective. She talked about Eleanor Hart's novel and how it mirrored her struggles. And she shared the lesson she had learned: once you've accepted your flaws, no one can use them against you. The audience gave her a standing ovation, but what mattered most to Lydia was the young woman who approached her afterward. With tears streaming down her face, the woman said, "Thank you for sharing your story. I've spent my whole life hiding my flaws, but now I see they're part of what makes me who I am." Lydia smiled and took the woman's hand. "We're all mosaics," she said softly. "Broken pieces made whole." Moral ending. Lydia's journey teaches us that our imperfections are not weaknesses, but opportunities for growth and connection. By embracing our flaws and vulnerabilities, we can transform them into sources of strength and beauty. Life is not about being perfect, It's about being authentic and finding the courage to show up as we truly are.